Good afternoon and welcome to special coverage of the HST referendum. BCers have voted to kill the harmonized sales tax. You see the numbers there rounded up. The numbers voting yes, 54.73%. Voting no, 45.27%. BCers have voted down the HST, and the next half hour here, we're going to break down what this all means for the province and what this means for the people here of BC as we're starting to get reaction from both sides, both parties. Obviously, this will affect potentially an election coming up with the BC Liberals, with Premier Christy Clark. We hope to hear from her a little bit later during this cast, hear her reaction, and also the Finance Minister, Kevin Falcon, is standing by. We'll hear his reaction as well. Now, this all started rolling out this morning just before 11 o'clock. It was started to be a little bit of mad. I was at the legislature as the Elections BC brought the results through the ledge, carrying the sealed envelope with the cameras, with the reporters following Elections BC, running around. This is all happening at about 11:15 or so. Everybody waiting for the results, all the media there, everyone wanting to be the first to break out the results of what happened. And as you can see from some of those images, quite a scrum. We did talk with Elections BC. Here is what Craig James had to say about the process that he just went through.
I'm very pleased with the performance not only of Elections BC and the mechanisms that have been employed to ensure that this vote had a great deal of integrity, but also all of the employees who have worked so hard and so diligently to reach this point. So,
what was the toughest part for you?
The toughest part for me were the threats. And, okay, we should be going, but that was, for me, on a personal level, not a pleasant experience.
So you heard there Craig James from Elections BC talking about the process there, and him talking about actual personal threats and some personal hardship that he went through this controversial process and tax that started way back when. For more insight on this, I'm joined by Mike Smith from the province. Mike, it's been a while since we've seen a circus like this at the legislature. It kind of sums up BC politics as a whole. I mean, this is nothing new, but it's been a while. What's your gut take on what went down here today?
Well, it's a very dramatic moment. You know, this has been going on for 2 years, right, since people started fighting against this tax. So to see the actual result delivered in the way it was, that was quite a moment up in the press gallery, that crush of reporters around Craig James and everybody scrambling to get the result. At the end of the day, it's a result, Scott, that was more or less predicted. Most of the pundits and analysts and pollsters were predicting that the yes side was going to win this and that it was going to be a yes vote to say no to the HST and scrap the HST. So a 54% margin is about what the pollsters were predicting, but still a dramatic moment to see this happen. And this is the first time this has happened in Canadian history. There has never been a jurisdiction in Canada that's had an initiative vote like this, where a citizen-led petition drive results in the death of a tax. So this is, we're making some history here this morning.
Do you think it means we'll be hearing Bill Vanderzam from Fight HST? He's at a press conference right now. We'll be rolling on his clip in just a second. And also, we're waiting for the Finance Minister to talk. In the meantime, like you're saying, this historic moment, do you think it sets a precedent? Do you think now it's believed that this can be done and people can take an issue and force it out or push government harder than they could before?
I think it's a wake-up call for government that, in addition to people being angry about the tax itself, people were angry about the way this tax was foisted on them. Don't forget that the Liberals in the last election said this tax was not on. They said that this tax was not on the table, and they actually put that in writing and said we're not contemplating the harmonized sales tax. Then they brought it in literally within weeks of winning the election. People were furious about it, and they rose up against it. So I think it's a wake-up call for government that, hey, you can't really get away with this stuff anymore. However, don't forget that the rules were amended on this citizen initiative vote. It's supposed to be non-binding. Under the letter of the law, it's supposed to be non-binding. Premier Gordon Campbell, back when he was Premier, said, no, I'm going to make this a binding vote, so that even though under the law we could ignore the vote and bring in the HST anyway, we're going to listen to the will of the people. So I don't think it sets a precedent in that legally they're going to change the law to make these type of things, these type of votes binding in the future, but it's a heck of a wake-up call for government that if you're going to hit people with a tax like this, you better be upfront about it.
And it shows your passion may go a long way. And speaking of that, the face of Fight HST, Bill Vanderzam, spoke just a few minutes ago, about 5 minutes ago. Here's a little bit of what he had to say.
This is a historic day, not only in our province, but in the country. It's the first time in the British Commonwealth that the people actually had a say in how it is they're taxed. More importantly, I think, too, it sent a message to politicians throughout our country especially, that they can't simply do things because it's the will of a premier or the party, that they have to, in fact, on an issue as big as we see it here, consult the people. And we're already now hearing the premier talking about a Plan B. But Plan B so far has been quite secretive. And if Plan B goes the way of Plan A, they're in trouble again. So I would tell the Premier and the government right now that if you have a Plan B, involve the people in your Plan B. They need to have a say. It's they that pay not only the taxes, but your wages, your benefits, and your pensions.
So there's Van der Zalm having his say. There's a lot going on right now because we're still waiting for Kevin Falcon. Mike Smith had his phone to his ear just a second ago, waiting to hear from the finance minister and what's going on there. Still waiting for reaction from the premier. Just talking about some of the statistics out there because they've broken down all the ridings in terms of percentages. Interesting or not, Oak Bay Gordon Head here on the island was the only riding on the island that voted no. To stay with the HST, whereas the Nanaimo North Cowichan was one of the ridings that overwhelmingly voted yes to scrap the tax. Whether it's a surprise or not, Oak Bay obviously an affluent neighborhood.
Right.
Is that an indication maybe that there is a division on the HST just in terms of business, wealth?
Yes, sure it does, because there were actually quite a few ridings in BC that actually voted to keep the HST. Around just under 30% of the ridings said we wanted to keep the HST. So most of those ridings are in the wealthier, like you said, well-to-do, sort of higher income ridings. So that may indicate that the people who felt in those income brackets were maybe more inclined to accept this because of the arguments that this is good for business. The sort of lower income, middle income ridings tended to vote against the HST. And it also sort of fell along party lines. Oak Bay Gordon Head, one of the few liberal held ridings on the island. So, and it went to keep the HST. A lot of the ridings that, all the NDP held ridings in BC voted to scrap it. So I imagine that the NDP are looking at this result and saying, you know what, this is a pretty darn good result for us politically.
I was just going to ask you that. Do you think these numbers, 54% voting yes and 45% voting no, do you think that that has provincial numbers attached to it in terms of an election? Do you think the NDP is looking at that?
Sure. I think the NDP are looking at this and saying, you know what, every single riding that we held with an NDP MLA voted to get rid of the tax. A lot of liberal held ridings too.
We'll hold that thought. The Finance Minister, Kevin Falcon, is speaking. We'll take you there right now.
I want to say I'm joined by a number of members of our project transition team on going from HST to PST GST. Jordan, Paula, and Beth, thank you for being here. In case there are any particularly technical questions that need to be answered, they're here to assist on that regard. I want to start by, first of all, acknowledging all the British Columbians who participated in this referendum, frankly, whichever side they happen to be on. Democracy is ultimately built on participation in the voting process, and we thank all of those who took the time to vote, regardless of which way they voted. I'm obviously, as a finance minister, disappointed by the result, but not altogether surprised. We recognized when we started from a place where 85% of the public was opposed to the HST, in large measure due to our own mishandling of the introduction of that major policy change, that we had an uphill battle. But we worked hard to ensure that we would try as best we could to get information to the public, to ensure that the public, as best they could, would make an informed decision on how we're going to move forward. So where do we go from here? Well, we have a plan, and I'm going to take a moment here to walk you through it. The first is that the PST will be restored at the 7% rate. The target time in terms of restoring the PST so that we're back into a PST-GST system is about 18 months. So we're anticipating March 31st, 2013, and that is consistent, as you may recall, with the independent panel report that talked about a period of 18 to 24 months. We're going to push for the low end of the scale. If we can do better, we will. But that, we believe, is the responsible time frame in terms of going back. The permanent exemptions that were there before will return. We reserve the right to make some administrative changes, mostly of a relatively minor nature, mostly to just bring, as best we can, 60-year-old legislation into the 21st century. In other words, to make it easier for small businesses and business to report, et cetera, as they are dealing with the PST. And as you know, we're going to be going back, so that means that the low income tax credit is replaced with what was there before. And we are also engaged in discussions, and we'll have continuing discussions with the federal government on exiting the agreement we have. It's commonly known as Sitka with respect to the HST. And we will be fulfilling our obligation to return the $1.6 billion of transition funding. That is going to be subject to negotiations and discussion. I'm not going to be having a public negotiation, but we will honor the commitment we made to keep up our end of the bargain. I intend to be meeting with Minister Flaherty in September to begin those discussions on how we are going to do that. There will also be public consultations that I'm going to arrange going forward in terms of how we're going to deal with the fiscal impact, particularly in the out years. So once we go back to a PST-GST world, as you well know, there are significant fiscal impacts in terms of the dollars that are generated under a PST-GST, and that was pointed out in the independent panel report. And so obviously we need to have a discussion with the public on how we are going to responsibly deal with that. The next thing I want to walk you through is the action plan that we're putting in place. So we started federal provincial discussions a number of weeks ago. We really were operating from the assumption that it's likely that we were probably going to have to face a potential PST-GST situation. So we've had a project team in place. It's headed by Doug Foster, who many of you will know from the Finance Ministry. And we are going to work with the federal government on their transitional rules and systems that need to be put in place. And by that, what I mean is that the federal government, in addition to repealing their legislation which put the HST in place, will need to define and create transitional rules so that the business community will understand what the rules of the game are for transitioning back to PST-GST. So that, for example, if you're making a purchase over a number of years, you're going to have some years where you're under the old HST and you get input tax credits, and then you're going to go back to the PST world, which changes. And so there needs to be transitional rules put together for virtually every sector in the business community. So it is not an inconsequential thing. We will also have to develop provincial legislation and our own transitional rules. So once we know what the federal transitional rules are, our team will put in place mirrored rules that will be at the provincial level. And of course, we also have to work on the legislation and regulations to re-implement the provincial sales tax. Systems development and implementation is self-explanatory. Provincial administration, we're going to have to set up a PST office again. We're going to have to start to rehire staff again to manage the provincial sales tax. And we've got to have business registration and outreach and business transition. And I'll take a second on that because it's important to recognize that for the business community, we have to have time to make sure that they can transition back into a PST world. And that means that they're going to need time to update their systems to understand what the rules of the game are going to be under PST. And we also have to reach out to the businesses, some 30,000 of them, that have never operated in a PST world, because they are businesses that have started since we introduced the HST, and they are businesses that continue to start in British Columbia to the tune of almost 1,000 a month. So we have to make sure that we have outreach and we have communications with them so that they understand how they are going to operate in a PST world. And there's other stakeholders that we'll be dealing with. What I can tell you is that we intend to report out on a quarterly basis. So every time I, as the Minister of Finance, will be reporting out on our fiscal situation every quarter, as we normally do, we will include a piece on where we're at in terms of transitioning back to the PST. What you see here is really just an expansion of what I was just saying in terms of some of the things that take place in terms of transitioning back. And so you can have a look at that later and ask questions if you wish. But essentially, those are the time frames that we anticipate each of those particular services or work that's required are going to take. And then that gets us to the target of 18 months. The next is the public consultation. As you know, we're going to have a public consultation process initiated with the first quarterly report, which will come out in early September. And that is the normal budget consultation process that is undertaken. That is going to be separate and distinct from a broader public consultation we're going to have in terms of dealing with the fiscal impacts of going back to PST. But that will be the usual public budget consultative process that the Budget Finance Committee will go out, the Legislative Finance Committee will go out and undertake with respect to talking to the public. You know, obviously, that the return to the PST creates some significant pressures in terms of government budget. You'll remember that back on May the 1st, or I think back in May, I outlined that going back to the PST GST would have about a $3 billion impact to provincial finances. 1.6 billion of that, of course, is the repayment of the transition dollars to the federal government. The balance of that are the lost revenues as a result of 2 years of reduced revenues under a PST GST world. Obviously, we are going to work to ensure that we can manage that, and we will be able to manage that. In the September quarterly report that I will be releasing, we will outline what the fiscal impacts are with respect to the decision to go back to PST GST. And of course, we will manage the fact that we will have lower revenues in the out years, and we will also manage the costs of the additional costs of hiring staff and putting into place a PST world. I think it's important to recognize that though this creates a challenge, it is important to put the challenge into context. British Columbia enjoys a AAA credit rating. We've enjoyed a AAA credit rating that we've restored from a position in the 1990s where we had multiple credit rating downgrades as a result of good fiscal management.
Finance Minister
And
Kevin Falcon there explaining how the government is going to roll this, the death of the HST, to put it bluntly, over the next 18 to 24 months. Mike Smith from the province here with me. Mike, listening to that now, there's got to be some stuff in there that's jumping out.
Sure, there's a number of significant things there. One, that he said that we're going to go back to the HST or the provincial sales tax, that is, by 2013. So that's significant because there has been some speculation, hey, maybe they try and wiggle out of this somehow and say, we'll keep the HST until 2015, and that way we won't have to pay back that $1.6 billion to Ottawa, because there's a 2015 escape clause there. So he's clarifying, no, we're not going to do that. We're getting out of it in 2013. So that's a big one. He also said that we're going to go back to the old provincial sales tax exemptions. They're not going to try and monkey around here or pull some kind of bait and switch where they're going to change the exemption rules for the PST. He's saying we're going to go back to the old provincial sales tax the way it existed before. So that's some new clarity for him, because he had been kind of hedging on that previously. And the big one is that he said there at the end, you heard him talking about the impact this is going to have on the budget, right? Because the HST brings in a lot of money to the government, and he's saying getting rid of it is going to blow a $3 billion hole in the government. That leaves this government in a big pickle. That's a lot of money. What are they going to do? Their options are, do we raise taxes? We raise other taxes to make up that money? Maybe we cut government spending to save money as a result. Maybe we break our promise to balance the budget in a year, which Christy Clark has said she's going to do. These are all very unpalatable options.
He also mentioned that he said they're going to consult with the public, which we just did with the HST, and we saw how that went. Consult with the public. Is that another committee? Is that another referendum? Is that a provincial election? Well,
it could be any of those, Scott. This is real. This is up in the air here, because he's saying none of those options are palatable for the government. They don't want to cut spending. They don't want to raise taxes. They don't want to break their promise to balance the budget. What are they going to do? So he's saying we're going to consult with British Columbia. And so there is a budget consultation process that goes on normally through a budget. He's saying they're going to modify that a bit and talk to British Columbia. So there's going to be more talk, more consultation, and then we'll find out. But like you said, there's election fever around here, right? Christy Clark has said, hey, maybe I'll call an election in the fall. So is that going to be the consultation process? She's going to go out and run on some kind of agenda for what she's going to do in an election? We don't know.
Well, you think they could?
Maybe we'll ask her that, though, when she comes out.
Yeah, we're expecting to hear from her in about half an hour or so, and of course we'll have coverage throughout the afternoon. Now, her Plan B that she has indicated, the Premier saying Plan B is going to kick in. She's been talking about that over the last 48 hours or so. She did mention at Ian Black's resignation, she started talking about job creation, defending BC jobs. I imagine that we are looking at an economic platform if she's going to call election. I'm going to get your take on that in just a second, but I'm going to quickly go to break. We'll be right back here live from the legislature, special coverage on the HST results.